Well, good evening once again. I want to echo what Reagan just said and welcome all of you here. A lot of you have been coming the last couple nights, and I hope it's been encouraging. And if you're here for the first time tonight, we're glad that you chose to be here, and we hope that you're able to come back tomorrow. But this is an encouraging weekend. It has been for me and everything leading up to it and the efforts to prepare it. And I hope that you will benefit from it. Some of these questions that we all have and that some people never get answered. We are trying to answer those. And I hope that we've been able to do an adequate job of that. And I hope that can continue to be the case tonight. Growing up, you had several different core classes that you would take in school: math and history and English and science. Science was definitely one of those major foundational classes. And as you got older and started getting more into the high school range, you would have different types of science classes that you would take. You would have like physics and genetics and biology, and the list can go on. And you took some of those classes, and I took some of those classes. And as you took those classes, your teachers and your science textbooks would overall try to tell you how the world is supposed to work. Like maybe this is the evaporation cycle, this is how that works. Or your cells and your DNA and how they help you to function. Or this is the periodic table of elements and how it kind of makes up the core out of everything that we see around us. Those seem like pretty reasonable examples of science, right? But then sometimes your classes and your textbooks would try to get a little more big picture in the questions that they answered. Like, how did all of this happen? How did we get here? How did this universe come into being? And where do we fit? Where do we fit into the universe? How did we get here? And those type of questions are given answers, answers that are provided by mainstream science of the day. And what are those answers? Like if you had to boil down those answers to a small sentence or two, it would probably be, well, all of this started through a big bang. And the way that we got here is we evolved from less complex species, which evolved from some kind of elemental soup in which some particles collided and boom, life was formed. And here we are. Is that answer true? You believe that? Well, probably the fact that you're here tonight says a little bit about what you think about that answer. But maybe you're on the fence or you've had that sort of question before, and we hope to be able to answer that tonight. And there are a lot of different pathways to answer that question. How did we get here? We're going to try to look at the science and see, does science disprove the Bible? Because when you throw religion into the mix, things change quite a bit, don't they? Now, the Christian book that we have, the Bible, says in the very first verse that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. At the end of the same chapter, it says that God created man. Doesn't say anything about a big bang or evolution, none of that's mentioned. But what you do find is a creator. And this creator is who Christians worship. This creator is the one that Christians spend their entire lives working for and living for. Now, does that make sense? Does it make sense for Christians to believe in a creator and an intelligent design? Does science disprove the Bible? Now, like Reagan mentioned, this is a very broad topic and many different directions that we could go. I just kind of hope to provide a general framework, give you some things to think about moving forward, and maybe some meat and some ammo if you ever encounter people who bring this up. You can share some real science with them. So, in this lesson tonight, the general framework of what we're going to be looking at, here in just a moment, we're going to spend some time thinking about Christians and science in general and how they relate to each other and if they can really relate at all. We're going to spend some time thinking about the big picture of the universe, how it came into being. Was it a big bang? Was it something else? And we're going to spend some time thinking about us. How exactly did we get here as humans? And what does modern science have to say about that? Throughout the lesson, I'll be flashing up from time to time some various quotes given by both atheistic scientists and Christians to hear what they have to say from their own words. So it's not just me making things up from an unbiased standpoint. And I hope these points will kind of kickstart further study for you as you dive more into the nuances of this topic and build your faith. And I'll also say, if you happen to be here tonight, or if you're listening online, either live or afterwards, and you're someone who is coming at this from more of an outsider's perspective, Like you don't really believe in Christianity all that much. Like it's overall a bunch of myth and superstition. Christian just kind of a blindfold on. All I'm going to say is give this lesson a fair hearing, and I'm going to try to give this information a fair hearing as well. So I want to start off with thinking about this question: are Christians scientific or unscientific, rather? Because that's the general stigma that's given in the modern day scientific landscape. Christians just don't know what they're talking about. But interestingly enough, that's not how it always used to be. This is kind of more of a modern day thing. In fact, some of the leading scientists that we think of from history were actually Christian. Think about Newton and Kelvin and Planck and Boyle and Mendel and Copernicus, and the list can go on. Some of those big names that you'll read about in your scientific textbook. In fact, Newton himself said that this most beautiful system of sun, planets, and comets could only proceed from the counsel and dominion of an intelligent and powerful being. Things have changed since then, haven't they? Pretty rapidly. Nowadays, the thought is these poor Christians have no idea what they're talking about. We're kind of looked at in an almost pitiable way because we're still living in the dark ages. We haven't caught up with the times. We believe in a book that's outdated, and the list can go on. That's the picture that you're going to get and hear from prominent scientists who write books and who go on television and who teach in universities. And I'm just going to say bluntly right off the top, that's not true. That's not an accurate depiction of Christians. No, Christians are and should be people who look at evidence. Christians are not people who laugh in the face of science and say, we're going to believe whatever we're going to believe, even if there is zero evidence to prove it. No, Christians don't hide from the truth. We run to it. In fact, that's kind of why we're doing this lesson right now, isn't it? To look at the truth. To be honest, if you were to turn the microscope back around to some of the scientists of our day and age, you're going to find exactly what they sometimes accuse Christians of doing: hiding evidence, having stigmas associated with evidence. Because right off the bat, when thinking about some of those big picture questions that I mentioned earlier, they throw out certain conclusions right off the top before even starting their process of looking into it and researching it. Now, if you throw evidence out before giving it a fair hearing and you come to the end of your research and you have these different conclusions, naturally, what you threw out at the start is not going to be amongst your conclusions. Meaning, if you think about those universal questions and you automatically throw God out of the equation off the top, when you get to the end of your research, naturally, God's not going to be given as a potential answer. But real science doesn't throw out possibilities off the top. That's a biased study in every sense of the word. At that point, science has become an atheistic ideology before ever exploring other explanatory possibilities for some of these big picture questions. Science is supposed to go where the evidence leads you. Isn't that fair? That accurate depiction of science? Go where the evidence lies. It's not exactly what scientists are doing nowadays. And kind of commenting on this, the modern day scientific landscape, here's a quote from Dinesh D'Souza on the way science is kind of laid out. If a space shuttle were to produce photographs of a never before seen solar bodies that bore the sign Yahweh made this, or another name for God in the Bible, would the scientific community still refuse to acknowledge the existence of a supernatural creator? Yes, it would. And the reason is both simple and surprising. Modern science was designed to exclude a designer. So dogmatic is modern science and its operating procedures that today all evidence of God is a priori rejected by science. Even empirical evidence of the kind normally admissible in science is refused a hearing. Doesn't matter how strong or reliable the evidence is, scientists, acting in their professional capacity, are obliged to ignore it. The position of modern science is not that no miracles are possible, but rather that no miracles are allowed. Now, why exactly is he saying this? Because of other prominent quotes just like this one. I know this is one of Mike's personal favorites. We cannot allow a divine foot in the door. Does that seem very open-minded to you? Doesn't to me. Note, taking out evidence before giving it a fair hearing is not science, and it never will be. When it comes to God, when it comes to Christianity, evidence is the basis of Christian faith. Evidence that you can find from both history and nature, some of which we're going to be looking at and thinking about tonight. And that's where we have to look. We have to look where the evidence lies. What are the odds of some of these things happening in the world around us. Because when you start looking into some of the numbers of what atheists claim to have happened, the way that things laid out and the years and all of that, the different numbers, the odds of these things happening, you're going to find that the odds of the things happening the way they said they did are completely astronomical and really don't make much sense at all. And I'll kind of show that a little bit here in a moment. So, where do the odds and the evidence lie when it comes to a creator and a designer of the universe, when it comes to how we function in these bodies today? Let's think about some of those. I want to start with thinking about the universe and how it came into being. Big picture. The answer that you're going to be given in mainstream science is the Big Bang. And you've heard that phrase plenty before, but let's just give a general kind of timeline definition for the Big Bang. Big Bang says around 14 billion years ago, there was a single speck that rapidly expanded faster than the speed of light for under 1 second. And within that 1 second, the process kind of slowed down and then continued through a process called inflation. 200 to 300 million years after that, we have the first stars. And then around 9 billion years after that is when our planet and our solar system enter the picture. So what we have here on the Earth, about 4 to 5 billion years old or so. That's the general gist of the timeline for the Big Bang. Now, does this route make the most sense? The thing about believing in this route is there are still many questions, many things that need to be answered. In fact, most scientists and atheists have no idea how to answer it, and they will admit they cannot answer some of the imperative questions that are needed to back up this model. Like, what exactly started or caused the Big Bang? Like, what came before it? Those are pretty important questions, right? And there's not a real good answer for it. Ultimately, the Big Bang is a way to postulate existence by taking God out of the equation, even when you do not have all of the facts. And so, in response to this, I want us to think about a few different things. When you look out into the universe, you see patterns of design. This is similar how you might go to an island that you initially think is deserted, yet you happen to see footprints in the sand and you see small building structures. And naturally, you come to the conclusion that there's someone else on the island with you. You don't question their existence, even though you have never seen them before with your own eyes. Now, maybe you think about what their character is like and how they fit in and some of those questions, but their existence is not really at question because you know nature producing those things doesn't make any sense. Like that just doesn't happen. It's the exact same thing when it comes to the universe and God. His fingerprints are all over the place, but because we don't always see them in a fleshly human way, atheists will try to discredit the fingerprints. Now, true, I will admit, it does take a level of faith to tie those fingerprints to God, but let's not forget that atheists also have faith too. Just something that will continue to develop going forward. Now, you can't necessarily prove God quite the same way that you prove 2 plus 2 equals 4, but atheists also cannot prove that he does not exist. So at that point, the question becomes which route is more plausible? Which one makes more sense? Here's kind of another quote, kind of summarizing this idea and talking about it. Science, therefore, can be thought of as a quest for what Polanyi called a hidden reality toward which clues are pointing. Here, the use of the word clue is very significant because it points immediately to a degree of certainty in our knowledge. We observe certain things, but what is their meaning? C.S. Lewis famously described things such as the human sense of right and wrong as clues to the meaning of the universe. Such clues are not hard proofs, they are soft pointers. The accumulation of such clues often has an intellectual intensity that transcends the power of some so-called proofs. So soft pointers and clues. What clues do we see regarding the universe in relation to God? So I want to kind of dive into a couple of these specifics and think about a few different ones. Let's think about our universe and the way that it is laid out. One of the interesting things that you're going to find in the universe is how it is fine-tuned with different cosmological constants. Basically, our universe is fine-tuned to support life. And that is a clue to the meaning of the universe, insignificant in isolation, but richly suggestive when set alongside other such clues. So, in thinking about these like cosmological constants, I want you to imagine a panel full of small little dials. Like if you've ever been in an audio booth before and you've seen the different layout and how you can turn one little dial and it can completely change the sound system, imagine something like that with these universal constants, things like the speed of light in a vacuum or the gravitational constant. Now, I want you to imagine just randomly all of those dials spinning and automatically making it possible for life to be here, which there's only a very small range of possibilities for life to have come into being. Now, atheists will say this happened by random chance. The odds of those dials randomly coming into effect just the way they are, where it makes life make sense, is this number right here. 1 in 10 to the power of 229. I'm going to be honest, this number here, if you were to write it out, it doesn't make much sense at all. It's kind of hard for our minds to even fathom what this number means. You're going to talk about astronomical. That right there is absolutely astronomical. So it seems, therefore, that our universe was carefully designed to support life, and this is what makes the most sense. This creation took careful involvement to be possible, not just a random twiddling of dials and boom, like it all just came into place. So that's kind of one thing to think about there. Another thing that I want to spend a few minutes talking about in relation to the universe are some of the universal laws that we have in effect. And I want to spend more time talking about these because they relate to the idea of the Big Bang, I think, quite well. So we're going to look at a few different ones of them. So, the laws of the universe. Firstly, science is governed by a set of unchangeable laws, and there's no debate on this fact, even within the scientific community. We as humans have discovered that these laws exist, but we don't really have any evidence for how they came into being. And there is zero evidence that these laws are just able to write themselves, meaning they had to come from somewhere, or something, or maybe some being. To say that these laws just appeared requires a blind faith in some unknowable and unprovable idea. So, what do these laws say? Well, overall, these laws actually provide strong evidence in opposition of a Big Bang model. I want to look at a few of these. For example, the first law of thermodynamics. This law states that matter and energy cannot come from nothing. So that's a simple point. Something cannot come from nothing. Matter and energy can exchange states, but the total amount in the universe must remain constant. To kind of deal with this problem, scientists will start throwing around phrases like quantum fluctuations and things like that. But in the end, there's no good natural answer for where matter or energy came from, meaning it had to come from something outside the natural realm. Now, what exactly does that sound like? Or better yet, who exactly does that sound like? Well, to me, it kind of sounds like the biblical picture of God, something that's said here in Romans chapter 4. God is the one who gives life to the dead and calls the things which do not exist as though they did, which is a power that a creator God would possess. I used the word natural just a second ago, natural causes, as opposed to believing in a creation, being a naturalist versus a creationist. The thing about being a naturalist, though, is that they'll often use supernatural explanations to back up their reasonings. No one who calls themselves a naturalist is truly a naturalist because even a Big Bang explanation requires taking forces outside the natural laws that govern our existence to fit into their argument. So, all of that is to say, matter and energy has to be created by something outside the natural realm. That's what this law states. Something cannot come from nothing. Now, if you were to believe in a Big Bang model, you have two options. Either you believe in that, something came from nothing, which based on this law is not possible, or you have to believe that matter and energy are eternal. Like they were always there in some type of way. Only problem with that one is that the second law of thermodynamics actually casts that one down. I have a fancy little chart up here. I don't expect you to really know or care what exactly it says on here. It's just to show I'm not making this up. That's kind of the scientific chart. I'll boil it down. To explain this in simpler terms, this law states that matter and energy in the universe is running out, the available use of energy, and entropy or disorder, it's kind of the fancy word for it, is increasing. Now, let me use a simple illustration for this. I want you to imagine you have a hot cup of coffee. I'm sure we have several coffee drinkers in the audience today. You have to wait for it to cool down a little bit. Now, I want you to imagine you putting a hot cup of coffee within a room, and that room being completely sealed off from the external environment. Like no outside forces or energy are interacting with that room. Well, what happens over time with a hot cup of coffee in a regular temperatured room like this one? Well, eventually that heat will kind of dissipate, right? It'll go away, it'll go out into the room. And if there are no outside forces, then the coffee in the room will reach an equilibrium. Like they will be the same temperature. And without any sort of external forces, there's no more available energy to use. This is a process that's called heat death. Heat cannot go back into the coffee. No more available energy is able to be used without something else coming into the room. Now, if you take that and apply it to the universe on a universal scale, I want you to imagine the stars, things like our sun, as these hot cups of coffee up in the night sky. And slowly but surely, they are losing heat. Available energy is going out into the universe. And theoretically, after a very long period of time, there would be something called a universal heat death. No more available energy to be used. Now, the point with this idea and this law is that the universe cannot be eternal. So, when we think about some of the conclusions from what I just said, there was a moment of peak available energy in the universe, which we would say creation in the beginning, and since then it has to be winding down. Well, if it's not eternal, then that leaves one possibility. Something outside the natural realm had to put all of this energy here in the first place at a moment in time. And that something or someone has to be outside the bounds of a law like this, which leaves us with the most plausible conclusion: a creator. In fact, the Bible, in not so many words, even kind of comments on this idea of the second law of thermodynamics. In Psalm 102, says, "Of old you laid the foundations of the earth and the heavens in the work of your hands. They will perish, but you will endure." Yes, they will all grow old like a garment, like a cloak you will change them, and they will be changed, but you are the same, and your years will have no end. Even though everything around us is winding down and the heavens are wearing out, we know that God was and is still in control. So, those are the two laws of thermodynamics. After this, I want to look at probably the simplest law to understand. This is the law of causality, probably the most fundamental one that we can understand here as humans. Basic idea that any effect we see has to have a cause behind its existence. The reason that your toe hurts is because you just stubbed it on the counter. And you understand that. Our lives are built around causes and effects like that. That makes sense. Well, the universe that we see around us is an effect, which means there had to be a cause behind it coming into being. So when you connect that and build it onto some of what we already just talked about, if matter and energy could not have always existed and it can't bring itself into existence, then cause outside of nature had to do that. One more Bible verse on that. "Before the mountains were born and you gave birth to the earth and the world, even from everlasting to everlasting, you are God." So, if you were to really think about this law and what it means, what about the first cause and effect? Like, where was the first one? What came before it? If you were just to look at this in purely universal terms based on the reality that we live in, you would keep on going back forever and ever. Like another cause and an effect and a cause and an effect. But God's outside of that, and He has to be. There has to be something outside the confines of the universe for the universe to ever come into effect. And that's where God enters the picture. God's outside the universe, which means that the rules of causation logically do not apply to him. So kind of think about it like this. I want you to picture God like the author of a novel. And you can open a novel and a book and you can read it and read about some of the characters within the novel and where they came from and what they're doing. And even if you were within the novel itself, if you were one of the characters, you can know about other things going on within the novel. But reading that novel is not going to give you specific insight into the author of the novel. You would have to go outside the bounds of the novel to meet and greet and talk with the author. The same thing if you were one of the characters inside the novel, you wouldn't be able to see and test the author. You're just one of the characters. Well, our universe is like this novel, and God is the author. He's outside of the novel, which means we don't have the capability to go outside of it and test him like you would regular science. He's outside the bounds of a law like this. He himself wasn't created, but he was the one uncaused cause of all existence, the one that operates outside the bounds of these laws, but the one that caused everything else to be. Kind of finished talking about these scientific laws. I'll just give you one last one more. And it too kind of builds on the previous things we've talked about while serving as a transition into what I want to talk about with the remainder of our time with the ideas of evolution. That's the law of biogenesis. So we find in nature that life always has to come from life. You cannot have life from non life. Now, believing in a naturalist view actually means ignoring science and saying that something unnatural had to happen at least once. At least one period of time, something unnatural had to occur. Basically, people stop being naturalists and become supernaturalists, which is what we as Christians would actually be called. But even though there's a law like this that is in effect, people will still argue that life spontaneously just happened and a simple organism came about. Well, this so called simple organism would need an operating procedure with a way to replicate itself. This type of operating program. You have to have that in order for your kind of species or your organism to continue. Otherwise, it immediately would have died out, disappeared, and that's that. Nothing else. Only problem is something like this doesn't just happen out of the blue. Like you don't just randomly find this in nature and boom, something has the capability as a simple organism to just come about. No, that's logically flawed and kicking against the goads of science itself. So, in a nutshell, those are a few of the different laws that you can see that are definitely in place in our universe, which don't really point towards a Big Bang model. No, these laws, which don't just write themselves, ultimately point more towards a creator who, with intelligent design, carefully formed all of what we see around us and wrote the laws and gave the constants that make life as we know it possible. That's the most plausible route. So that's big picture. That's the universe, a couple of things to think about. You can have some of this as your ammo. And by the way, I know I didn't mention this at the start, but I know this is a good bit of information. You want these slides? Please see me. I'll be happy to give them to you. But at this point, the question becomes, what about us? Like, where do we fit? How did we get here? Where do we come from? And that's conveniently where the teaching of Darwinian evolution enters the picture, which I would like to briefly address with the remainder of our time here tonight. So just kind of like I defined the Big Bang in a quick nutshell, if you were to look at Darwinian evolution, it says that life came into being around 3.8 billion years ago or so. Life came into existence on Earth. Initially, it consisted just of single-celled organisms, which evolved into multicellular organisms, which evolved into invertebrates, which evolved into vertebrates. And then the Homo genus came about 2 to 3 million years ago or so. And then we as humans came out of that. Now, first off, I want to say to truly believe in this process, there had to be random forming of life at one point. And concerning the odds of life just randomly forming, which had to have happened with Darwinism, there's a metaphor originally given by Fred Hoyle, which I like. It says, a living organism emerging by chance from a prebiotic soup is about as likely as a tornado sweeping through a junkyard and assembling a Boeing 747 from the materials therein. Right? Like that doesn't make any sense. A tornado comes in and all of a sudden you have a fully formed and functioning plane. Now, this is probably more likely than actually what this theory suggests. It's basically another way of saying that this is a miracle. It's a miracle how we're here. Come back tomorrow morning to talk more about miracles. But why do so many people believe in this? If this is true, if this is some sort of miracle, why do so many believe in this? I'll offer a few reasons, a few different suggestions. First off, there's brainwashing from a young age. Now, I'm going to say more about that here in a second. There's intimidation by media and scholars. If you bring up any sort of counter arguments or other evidence, you are laughed at. You're not given a fair hearing. It can just kind of shut you up. Maybe you want acceptance from the crowd, and people see that, well, the loud talking heads are saying that this is the reality, this is how we got here, and we don't want to stick out in a sore thumb, especially if we're like going to universities and stuff. So we'll just kind of go along with this. It allows you to escape accountability. This, along with the whole Big Bang model, because it means you don't really have to follow a Christian lifestyle. You can kind of do whatever you want. I mean, if these things are true, then there's really no sort of law that you need to follow. So there's that aspect of it. And then there's preconceived biases from personal life. It's not so much that people just naturally believe in evolution when they were born and that's what came to them. It's more so that they have a problem with Christianity based on something else that's happened to them in their lives. So those are some of the different reasons why. But going back to that first one about hearing about this from a young age, in our school systems today, evolution is taught as fact. Evidence regarding creationism is dismissed without a fair hearing, while evolutionists will make what end up becoming religious conclusions based on their personal beliefs. I mean, why else do they go around the world trying to spread their message as absolute truth? I mean, in reality, Darwinism is no less a religion than Christianity is. But school curriculum still requires that this ideology be expounded, even regardless of a teacher's personal beliefs. Last year, I was talking to an old woman in Minnesota, and she was telling me how back when her kids were in school, and this was a good at least 30 years ago, how one of her boys was in grade school, and this was being taught in his classroom. And afterwards, he went up to the teacher and said, I'm not sure I believe in all of this evolution stuff. She said, I don't either. I just have to teach it. That was like 30 years ago. It's not just a modern day problem. That shows you the state of where we're at right now, where the school system is. But to me, the most remarkable thing about this being in the education system isn't actually that something is being taught that goes against God's word. Like that doesn't really confound me too much. No, what is so dumbfounding to me is that Darwinian evolution has been repeatedly proven false by science. Like there's nothing to back it up. So even considering how secular the school system is, it doesn't make any sense that this is taught and put forth. Evolutionists themselves have very few answers to many of the imperative questions that require answering to truly uphold these ideas. Science is not on their side. But as is the case with many different areas, they'll continue to argue with you. So, in kind of thinking about some of the different aspects of Darwinian evolution, there, of course, are many different things you could focus on, but I just want to concentrate on a couple of them to kind of get you going, get you thinking. Going back to what I mentioned a little bit earlier, being a naturalist actually means believing in something supernatural. Supernatural abiogenesis, or life coming from non life, had to happen at least once. Well, once this happened out of nowhere, Darwin has claimed that these simple organisms evolved into everything that we see around us today. In order to do this, this would require a a genetic mutation. It would require a mechanism that brings raw new material into existence, and quite simply, there is zero evidence that this can happen and that this exists. And honestly, like Marvel's X-Men, mutated X-Men, are a little more believable than what this theory says. And ultimately, what this theory says is that in a state of macroevolution, so big changes, that everything traces back to a single celled organism over a long period of time. This is what's called Darwinian gradualism, a long period of time in which big changes happened. Well, if Darwinian gradualism is true, then we would expect to potentially see a couple different things. Maybe we would expect to see like millions of little evolutionary changes that ultimately add up to something big that you can see over time. Well, you don't find that. You don't find millions of little changes that show something big. And you don't find these random big jumps of evolution either. You don't find that. Ultimately, the bottom line is that macroevolution has been repeatedly not proved by science. You don't have evidence for it. But to me, perhaps the greatest evidence against this theory of Darwinian evolution, against this idea of mutation, is probably the fossil record, which, if you were to bring this up to certain atheists, they would probably cringe if you said this because they don't want to hear anything about it. To boil it down, the Earth consists of layers of different fossils from different time periods, and the deeper you go, the older the geologic column corresponds to. And the techniques to date those different layers are kind of another topic, another debate, which we don't have time to get into. I'll just say don't automatically believe the billions and billions of years answers that you get, because there's certainly flaws in those dating techniques, and you're welcome to talk to me afterwards about that. But at the base of this fossil record is what's known as the Cambrian explosion. And the Cambrian explosion is that in the first 2% of the geologic column, we find all 100 phyla that have ever existed, right there at the bottom in an explosion. In fact, at this point, we have 36 that are left, 64 have gone extinct, which actually shows you there was greater diversity at the bottom than there was at the top. There was no gradual evolution up the chain. They all appear at once at the bottom. Now, to be consistent with an evolutionary model, this area would have to contain fewer life forms, and the life forms would need to be less complex and less formed with little diversity. On the other side, if you were to believe in a creationist model, what you would expect to see is diverse and fully formed species, life forms, in an explosion at the bottom. No transitional fossils, and guess what? That is exactly what you see. There is an abundance of diverse, fully formed species, some of which we still see today. Stephen Jay Gould, who is a prominent atheist and evolutionist, particularly in the second half of the 20th century, said this: "The problem of the Cambrian explosion has not receded, since our more extensive labor has still failed to identify any creature that might serve as a plausible immediate ancestor for the Cambrian faunas." Still a big problem. Additionally, in order to support evolution in this vein, you would have to find evidence for these transitional species throughout the fossil record. This is what the missing links were supposed to be. Heard about the missing links before, that idea? There's just one small problem with this. The missing links are actually missing, and they still are. Shocker, right? To this day, there is no evidence that humans evolved from apes or any other type of animal. The animals that you see deep in the fossil column are largely the same that you still see today in our world, and this problem was even addressed by the man himself, Charles Darwin. This is what he had to say about it. "The number of intermediate varieties which have formerly existed on the earth must be truly enormous. Why then is not every geological formation and every stratum full of such intermediate links? Geology assuredly does not reveal any such finely graduated organic chain, and this, perhaps, is the most obvious and gravest objection which can be urged against my theory." Do you know what he's just said here? He's just said that what should be the single greatest argument for the theory of evolution actually is not an argument at all. And he's not the only one that's said that. Here's a couple other brief quotes by some scientists and evolutionists. W.E. LaGrosse Clark of the Smithsonian: if evolution actually did occur, it can only be scientifically established by the discovery of the fossilized remains. Well, if evolution's true, it has to be proved by the fossil record. And it's not. Fossil species remain unchanged throughout most of their history, and the record fails to contain a single example of a significant transition. David Woodruff, UC San Diego. This kind of goes back to a theme of blind faith that I've kind of alluded to a couple times. This is more a case of someone like Darwin knowing or believing inside of his heart that evolution is right more than it is about the facts. He had already decided what he wanted to believe. Now, fossil record is just one of several different arguments in this area. I encourage you to do your own research into others. But when you take some of these elements and you start to put them together, you're going to see that Darwinists will try to work around what science actually means. For example, I've said this word natural or naturalist a couple different times. And if you think about the idea of naturalism, which is the belief system of a universe without a creator, and you compare it to this idea of empiricism, which is testing things through experience and observation, you look at these two definitions and they're not the same thing, right? Is that pretty clear? Like, naturalism does not equal empiricism. Like, that makes sense. In fact, you might even look at that empiricism word, which maybe you remember from when you grew up, like empirical science and observation. Like, that sounds like a good definition for science there. Like, what you see and experience and kind of testing that and working with that. Well, what happens is that some of these scientists have tried to say that empirical testable evidence and science go hand in hand with naturalism. In fact, they're pretty much the same thing. Naturalism is empiricism. It is science. No, it's not. If they're going to rely on science, then they should go the empirical route. Like, that makes sense, right? But you know why they don't? It's because Darwinian evolution is no more observable and testable than a supernatural creator. It's just not. Empiricism, which we do see and experience all around us, leads only to acknowledge microevolution, which creationists wouldn't argue with. You see some microevolution at certain points, but this microevolution is not the picture that you get in textbooks. Now, what you get in this idea of Darwinian evolution are these big changes. How fish transition into this, and we came from apes, and all of those different ideas, the pictures that are just fabricated and made up in your scientific textbooks. So, to deal with this fact, dissenters from Darwinian evolution have to be labeled as crazy. Philip Johnson, who wrote a book on Darwin, kind of said this about it. As long as scientists make the rules, critics who demand positive evidence for Darwinism need not be taken seriously. They do not understand how science works. True science should be open to evidence. This ideology is not. Lastly, certain proponents of Darwinism, like Dawkins and Dennett, prominent scientists, will say that evolutionary processes are just random. How they lead to an indeterminate number of solutions. Basically, these useful and viable evolutionary changes, like things that are useful to promote life, they're just bound to happen. Like, they have to. This has to happen just randomly. However, the truth of the matter is that evidence from nature actually points towards what you would call a convergent hypothesis, which basically means there are only certain pathways which would lead to viability, which would lead to life. Like, you can throw chemicals and stuff into a pot a million times over and never come out with anything useful, anything that lasts and leads to life. It just wouldn't happen. But what you do see around us is that nature seems pretty well ordered, doesn't it? Like, we're here in these bodies, we seem to have useful functions. But the fact that this is true, the fact that nature seems to perfectly find those viable pathways of life, every time speaks more to a creator than it does to just mere processes of chance. One example I've read before about this is like you randomly finding a tiny little island in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. Now, what is more likely? You randomly stumbling upon this tiny island in the vast waters of the Pacific, or you being an expert and with research, knowing the layout of the ocean, you go and you find this tiny island. Expertise. What's more likely? You probably say, well, the person with expertise would more likely find it. And I agree with you. And that right there is another clue. And when you think about that in relation to the universe around us, that's another clue that leads you to God. I just have one more slide for us tonight. And I want to look at this passage, which shows a pretty good biblical picture of God and what he's done. Psalm 33, verses 6 through 11. By the word of the Lord the heavens were made, and all the host of them by the breath of his mouth. He gathers the waters of the sea together as a heap. He lays up the deep in storehouses. Let all the earth fear the Lord. Let all the inhabitants of the world stand in awe of him, for he spoke, and it was done. He commanded, and it stood fast. The Lord brings the counsel of the nations to nothing. He makes the plans of the peoples of no effect. The counsel of the Lord stands forever, the plans of his heart to all generations. That's the God that Christians believe in. That's the God that ultimately science points to. Now, science doesn't disprove the Bible. Actually, science only serves to help the case for the Bible and its creator. In fact, when you really start to look at it, and this is kind of another talk, but there are some things that science just can't answer. Because that's true, maybe we shouldn't look at science as the end all be all of our existence. Because in our day and age, science is put forth as the savior of humanity, as the highest explanation for life. Sometimes you need something more. How can science explain human nature? In fact, science can't even explain really what science is supposed to explain, which is what we just looked at tonight. And that's where God enters the picture. That's where Christianity is put on center stage, which you go down that route, it's a whole nother conversation. I just hope that this talk tonight opened the door to that conversation, to the realization that science and the Bible can and actually do coexist quite well. How we need to go where the clues lead us, to where what we see around us, where that points us towards. And ultimately, those clues and the fingerprints of God point us to a realm far beyond this one. And I hope that we can all open our minds to the journey of finding it. A journey that has been made easier by the words of God himself. I appreciate your attention tonight. I know there was a lot in that one lesson. I hope it was easily understood. If you have any questions, please see me and talk to me. I like to talk about this. But I hope that this can build your faith, and at least along the way, give you certain points to bring up, give you some ammo in the tank if you're ever dealt with these type of questions, because Christians need to be able to give an answer. And I hope that going forward, we will be able to do so.